Hey, everybody in the listening audience. Welcome back to the Noggin Notes podcast. I'm your host, Jake Wiskerson, proud co-owner of Zephyr Wellness, which is also a sponsor of this show. Please go to zephyrwellness.org to check out what we have to offer, or follow us on all the usual social media platforms, Instagram in particular, Facebook, YouTube for sure, and this channel. Also, thanks to Audible for sponsoring our show. If you go to audibletrial.com/nogginnotes, you can get a free 30-day trial and have access to their completely unmatched selection of audio content. You even get a free audio download. So grab an audiobook, download it, keep your audiobook even if you decide to cancel the free 30-day trial, and life goes on. But you probably won't cancel the free 30-day trial. You'll probably subscribe. audibletrial.com/nogginnotes to sign up and get yourself involved there. This interview is with a really fascinating gal. Her name's Brittany Phillips, and she's a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia in the U.S. Our conversation is wide-ranging, but we mostly talk about how people can deal with trauma, and in particular trauma, with the pandemic, but also generational trauma that may be experienced through racism or cultural divides and that sort of thing. So I had a good time talking to her, and I think you'll have a good time listening to her. Thanks again. It's always humbling to know that people take time out of their day to listen to what we have to say on this show, and we don't ever want that to go unacknowledged. So thank you for continuing to support and share our content. As I always say, it doesn't do any good locked up in my head. Please feel free to spread it around so that other people can heal as well. Without further delay, this is my interview with Brittany Phillips. Enjoy. Welcome back, listening audience. Thank you for, again, downloading our content. We appreciate it. And it's always humbling to know that people carve out time from their days to spend it with whatever we have to say, which is still mind-bending for me, that people would take their precious time and think so highly of what we do that they would listen to us. So today's episode, we have Brittany Phillips, and she's a licensed professional counselor in Georgia. You're in Atlanta. Hello, Brittany. How are you?
Hey, I'm great. How are you?
Awesome. I'm up here in Nevada. Everybody's familiar with that if they listen to the podcast for any length of time. In the Reno-Sparks area. It's not at all near Vegas. It's a 6.5-hour drive. Please don't make that geographic mistake. And you're in Atlanta, and you are a counselor there, but I'll let you finish introducing yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a licensed therapist here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I guess you could say the area that I kind of I'm passionate about. Some people say, oh, expert in, and I feel like, I'm not an expert in anything yet. I'm always learning and growing, but I'm very passionate about working with individuals who've experienced trauma, who struggle with anxiety, depression, or have experienced grief and loss. And I would say after the year we've had, I think we all probably can fit in one of those categories of experiencing some of that. So that's a little bit about the areas that I'm really passionate about and the work that I do. I also have a passion for speaking to the faith-based community about the intersection of psychology and spirituality. So a little bit about my passions.
I am really excited to get into that because those are the two areas. I think one, the trauma anxiety area, where people are curious, and I think they want to know the delineation of like when something bleeds into something else, the severity scale, so to speak, but also the integration. I love that you said intersection, because we use the intersection of guns and mental health for Walk the Talk America. So intersection is awesome. And talk about faith, spiritual faith, and psychology, because I think a lot of the times those stand across a kind of a self-imposed chasm as well. And it's high time we stop doing that because people need to heal. So in the meantime, though, what I want to know is, where are you originally from there, or did you move there from somewhere else? What's the story? How'd you get into the field? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So no, I was born and raised in a town called Rockford, Illinois, which is west of Chicago. So I moved to Atlanta when I was about 15. My parents moved here for better job opportunities. And so I went to high school here, ended up staying here, went to undergrad at Georgia State University. My major had nothing to do with psychology or counseling. I was in PR and music management. So I really wanted to work in the music industry. I have a lot of ties to the music industry. My family works in the music industry. So I was like, this is what I'm doing. So I dabbled into that, did a little bit of that. Also really interested in fashion. So I worked as a stylist, worked at a couple high-end retail stores, and so was kind of excited living that life. And I got married at 25, and I would say that first year of marriage was really tough. It was very challenging, and that was my first experience with counseling, me and my husband going to counseling. And I think through that experience, it was just such a healing experience. And so that was when I realized, man, this is what I want to do. We had an amazing therapist. Her name is Abby, and just the way that she walked through those dark moments with us. And it was just a transformational experience. And so I said, I think I want to do this. So I don't remember how old I was, maybe early 30s. I said, I'm going back to grad school. And so I went to Mercer and got my degree in clinical mental health. And that was kind of how I got into this.
Yeah, your agency, is it just you, or do you have employees or assistants? Do you host, students or interns, anything like that?
No, it's just me for now. I have a very small practice. I also do some work with the school district here in Georgia, and so that takes up a lot of my time. And then I love to do conversations like these. So, I can't have a large practice. I do a lot of speaking engagements as well. So it's just me at Phillips Psychotherapy.
What do you speak on when you do the engagements?
Yeah, so that it kind of ranges from a lot of things. So a lot of requests that I get is on anxiety, on grief and loss, like we said earlier, mental health and spirituality. How does that work? Kind of empowering our faith leaders to embrace discussions about mental health and empower the people that they lead to, seek professional help outside of prayer. And so a lot of the topics and conversations kind of revolve around those things.
Do you find yourself talking to groups of faith leaders, or do you go to individual churches and talk to the congregations? Like, how does that work? I'm really curious in doing more of that, I think, in my sphere.
Yeah, it's more so talking to groups of leaders. So like last week I did a call with a group of pastors from Florida. They have a denomination, an organization. And so one of the bishops that was over this organization, he reached out and said, hey, I'm having a meeting with 80 of my pastors, and I would love if you can come in and talk about grief and loss and how do we help our members through the holidays, And so I went in, did a Zoom call with them for about an hour and just really talked about grief. What is mourning? What's the difference? Talked about things that influence the way that we grieve, and then gave them some practical tips and tools that they can use when helping those that are grieving, or different things that they can put in place in their ministry to help those that are grieving. So usually it's groups of leaders. Occasionally a church will bring me in to talk about to their congregation. But usually it's the leaders that I'm talking to. And I love that, because I feel like that's where it needs to start. When we have the support of the leaders, then it's easy to bring everyone else on board when you have that support.
I 100% agree. And I love that you're doing that. And I like I said, I want to do it more, and maybe I'll hit you up, afterward offline to talk about it. But I think for the listening audience, if you don't mind, what I want to spend a little time on, just because you brought it up, is that grief and loss. What's the difference between grieving and mourning, and when does one stop and the other begins? Because I think, I say frequently that this stuff doesn't do any good locked up in my head. We got to share it with people so we can all heal together. So if you don't mind sharing what's locked up in your head, that's a topic I don't know that we've covered too well on this podcast before. So please, hover on that if you would.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit what I know. Like I said, I'm not a grief expert, but I do know a little bit. So when I'm thinking about grief, I think about that internal experience that we have. Grief is what we experience when there is a loss. And so many times we just associate grief with death. But I think it's associated with any type of loss. So just a loss of connection. And so when I'm thinking about someone that loses their job, they experience grief. Someone who goes through a bad breakup or a divorce, there's an experience of grief that happens, not just for those individuals, but even for the family that's experienced that. When I think about COVID-19 and I think about just the loss of the normalcy that we have, I think about grief. I think a lot of us had experienced some of those grief symptoms. And so that's that internal, that private response that we have to a loss. It could be a shared loss or an individual loss. And so when I think about mourning, I'm thinking about the rituals that surround grief. It's that period directly after the loss has happened. And there's not a time frame that I would put on it, but it's kind of that shared social response that we have. So when we're looking at mourning, that's when we're looking at people that have funerals or memorial services or candlelight vigils or whatever type of ritual that you put around that grieving process to kind of help. Some people say to give you closure. That's probably a whole nother discussion. I don't know what closure looks like, or what it looks probably different for different people. But I do know that grief needs to be ritualized. And so I think that encompasses that mourning process.
That's really well put. I've never considered the two like that, so I appreciate that. I always learn so much in these interviews. You bring up like closure, and we can touch on that briefly. Do we ever get closure? And I'll put that in air quotes because the audience can't see it. But I mean, there's a debate about that, right? Whether or not we actually do. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I think it's different for different people, and I think maybe some people need to have that language to come to a resolve within themselves. So I don't want to say that we don't ever get closure, because some people may feel like they have closure and that's what they need. But I believe that we don't get over grief. I think that grief is a part of love, and grief is something that we carry with us. There's a great book by Megan Devine. I think it's called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And she talks a lot about how we move forward with grief and we carry it with us because it's a part of love. So when I think about closure and it's the ending of a thing, I don't know if that's really what the goal of grief is. I don't know if the goal is to get over it and close that chapter and move forward. Because if love is there, I think we're always going to carry a piece of that with us.
That's reasonably fair to say. It seems maybe more like the appropriate assignment of closure would be to the mourning because it's a process, but the grief is almost like a scar maybe. So, you don't necessarily have to be influenced by it on a daily basis after a certain period of time, but it doesn't just go away, right?
Right. I like the way you said that. Yeah, absolutely.
It's just cool thinking out loud like this. For me too, with grief and loss, what it indicates to me, because I do a lot of emotional functioning, and we center on the 10 emotions as researched by Carol Izzard. One of those being sadness. Sadness' adaptive function is to tell us that our expectations didn't get met. So if we have this expectation that somebody's going to live longer than they do, I almost said forever, but I think sometimes we think that, right, unconsciously.
Yeah.
Or if we get surprised by the job loss that we didn't expect, any of these expectations, we get dumped or broken up with, or we totally expected to win the championship and we didn't. There's a sadness component there, right? And so if we can learn to endure and tolerate the emotion of the sadness, then it has applicability to the overall experience of the grief. And some are bigger than others, obviously. And I think maybe the magnitude impacts our life in such a way that, we need some professional processing with that. So what are some, I guess, some tips and techniques that you fall back on that are some of your favorites when you work with people who are experiencing this very heavy grief and loss?
Yeah, I think the first one is, just simple. I don't know if it's a tip or tool or technique, but it's just acknowledging what you feel. I think so many times we don't take the moment to actually feel our feelings. We don't, something happens and we feel something and we just kind of get busy and do something else. Like we don't take a moment to breathe into that space. Notice what it is. Like, oh my God, where do I feel that in my body? Why is my stomach tight? Like really sit and get curious and explore like what that is. So I would say first, like acknowledging and feeling what you feel. And I think journaling is a great way, writing it out. Some people are able to process emotions like that. I'm not so much a writer personally. It's so funny because I tell clients to do things and I'm like, you don't even do that yourself, girl. What are you talking about? So other options, like movement. I know that, emotions attached to our body and, trauma attaches to our body. And so we have to work that out. So for some, that may look like doing yoga or Pilates. For others, that might look like having a one-on-one dance party with yourself. It doesn't have to be a structured activity, but just doing something to get some movement. And